I chose to write my course paper on an evaluation of bail reform in America, focusing on the history and effectiveness of alternate pretrial release policies. I chose this topic for several reasons, but one of the most important ones is that America's system is unique due to its monetary element. Although much of America's system includes English influences, England had personal custodians instead of the cash bail system that we use. For this reason, I found this topic to be interesting, and this topic also intrigued me because it has modern relevancy. This is due to the fact that in 2017, the most recent wave of reformative policies regarding cash bail was put into place in New Jersey. In addition to these factors, the fact that there are compelling statistics calling for bail reform made me want to research this topic more. Many statistics calling for bail reform include the fact that there are disparities and unequal enforcement within America's cash bail system that affect impoverished and minority defendants the most. For example, defendants who cannot meet their bail amount are statistically more likely to receive longer or more severe sentences than the defendants that can pay the bail amount. And African American and Hispanic men are given disproportionately higher bail amounts than white men. African American men are given bail amounts 35% higher and Hispanic men are given bail amounts 19% higher. These injustices are what make me think the research evaluating the effectiveness of bail reform policies is so important. To get a holistic understanding of America's cash bail system and how it has changed over time, we have to look at its history. The history of America's cash bail system shows our system adopted many elements from England. This included the three practices of petition to right, habeas corpus, and limiting judicial abuse in bail determination. However, the early landscape of America was much more of a frontier setting than that of England, which made England's personal custodian practice of ensuring a released defendant would return for trial impractical. Therefore, America had to institute a cash bail as a safeguard for making sure defendants out on release would come back for their future hearings. The cash bail system ultimately led to the commercial bail bond industry we are familiar with today, because not every defendant can afford to pay their full bail amount on their own. This system went rather uninterrupted until the 1950s and 1960s when critical research started being conducted. This research prompted a change in policy that has been categorized into three identifiable waves of bail reform. The first wave of bail reform focused on releasing more defendants that were being held prior to trial. The most noticeable policy change in this wave was the release on recognizance policy. This implementation allowed certain defendants to be released on a promissory note to return for their future hearings instead of paying a cash bail. The Manhattan Bail Project served as an example of this implementation in practice, and the staff on this project made flight risk determinations that included a defendant's ties to the community, employment history, and prior criminal history to decide whether or not to suggest to the judge that a defendant be released on his or her own recognizance. Furthermore, to be more thorough, the staff members made follow-ups with released defendants that consisted of calling defendants to remind them of upcoming court dates and even transporting them via taxi to their trials in some cases. Overall, research regarding the effectiveness of this policy showed that defendants suggested for release on recognizance within the Manhattan Project were found to fail to appear for trial in less than 1% of cases, which is a rather high rate of success. Next, the second wave of bail reform showed a stark contrast to the previous policy considerations because this era focused on public safety concerns. Specifically, this period of time began in the 1970s and 1980s when the preventative detention policies were being put into the bail system. The District of Columbia Court Reform and Criminal Procedure Act of 1970 serves as an example of this new policy implementation. This legislation actually made it possible for a defendant's perceived dangerousness to be part of the bond evaluation and required the defendant to rebuke the assumption that his release would be a public safety hazard. In regard to the effectiveness of this policy, there were critical findings, namely the fact that preventative detention policies lack diagnostic tools such as risk assessments to make safety determinations. Additionally, research stated that in order to fully prevent offenses from being committed in the future, the criminal justice system would have to detain 8 non-recidivists for every recidivist successfully detained, which correlates with a high rate of false positives with a range of error being 50 to 60%. Therefore, the evaluation of preventative detention showed that these efforts had many inaccuracies in their practical implementation. Since uncovering some of the problematic elements within the preventative detention era, policymakers have begun reverting back to some of the first wave of bail reform's ideologies. Specifically, the modern and third wave of bail reform that we are currently in seeks to eradicate the wealth-based distinctions that cash bail creates, and maintains the government has no peniological interest when holding an individual in jail prior to trial. Therefore, the third wave of reform is instituting policy aimed at eliminating cash bail entirely, and only allowing pretrial detainment under a regulatory interest of public safety for the small amount of extremely dangerous defendants. The most noticeable policy change in modern reform is the switch from cash bail to risk assessments, and New Jersey's 2017 Criminal Justice Reform Act most clearly exemplifies this policy change. New Jersey has essentially eliminated the use of cash bail. Now a person will only be detained prior to his or her trial if the individual is categorized as at risk, with the Public Safety Assessment or PSA being the tool used by evaluators. The effectiveness of PSAs and the reform in New Jersey has begun to be determined through early research. Overall, research shows that New Jersey's policies have drastically reduced time spent in jail because on average the time a person will spend in jail pre-trial dropped from 62.4 days in 2014 to only 37.2 days in 2017. This was a decrease of 40%. And generally, appearance rates have remained high and recidivism rates have remained at the previous or typically average low that the criminal justice system was seeing prior to this implementation. Nonetheless, it is important to note that there has been a finding showing how not all crime rate has remained neutral to the new policy, because one study found that the rate of property crime per 100,000 people went up by 22.5% during the first 2 years after the criminal justice reform began in 2017 in New Jersey. The researchers presenting these findings offered the suggestion that this increase in property crime is due to New Jersey's criminal justice reform affecting a defendant's behavioral incentive to commit a property crime by reducing the expected sanctions upon arrest. But for the most part, these modern reforms being done in New Jersey are showing promising results, and they help showcase that it is possible for the consequences of cash bail to be removed without majorly disrupting court appearance or recidivism rates. In sum, I have some concluding thoughts on this topic. America's system is unique, but it has changed drastically throughout time, according to the mindset of the time and the research being conducted. And modern policies are really showing a lot of promising results. I think that several states will continue to expand what is being done in New Jersey. Additionally, these reform policies have taught the criminal justice system that the historic cash requirement is not necessary for a successful bail system. It is important to understand that America is no longer the frontier landscape that existed when cash bail was necessary. These modern reform policies and the new risk assessment tools show that our advanced society needs improved policies, especially since the old policy was unjustly applied and problematic. And here are some of the references that I used in my paper, and here are the rest of the references. Thank you for listening.